In the high-stakes game of geopolitics, words aren't just words. They can be weapons. But what happens when that rhetoric, that tough talk, completely backfires? When it creates real, painful economic and political problems? That's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to look at the incredibly high price of an openly anti-American posture, specifically for a country like Pakistan, and explore why sometimes the smartest, strongest move you can make is to say nothing at all.
Yeah, this quote, it really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It gets to a really tough reality in international relations. For countries that are, walking a very fine line, making a big confrontational statement isn't always an act of bravery. Sometimes it's a massive gamble, one that can expose some really deep vulnerabilities. And that brings us right to the core idea of this whole explainer. It's all about strength, not statements.
Okay, so let's just lay it all out there. The core thesis is this. For a country like Pakistan, an openly anti-American posture isn't just a bad idea. It's a major strategic liability. And look, this isn't about saying who's right or who's wrong or about choosing a side. It's just a cold, hard cost-benefit analysis. When you look at the current economic reality, the cost of that kind of confrontation it's sky high. And the benefits? Well, they're pretty much zero. And that's where this simple phrase comes in. Strength first, statements later. It's really the guiding principle for everything we're talking about. Think about it. A nation has to build up its economic muscle, its institutional power, before it can afford to step into the ring and make those big, bold, confrontational declarations. You've got to build the foundation before you can build the skyscraper, right? But you might be wondering, okay, how does this actually work? I mean, how can a few words from a leader spiral into real, tangible international pressure? Well, it happens through a system, a kind of mechanism that we're going to call the perception machine. So this is the chain of events, the dominoes falling one by one. It all starts with a simple narrative, a leader's public statements. But here's the thing. The international system, the global markets, they don't hear domestic politics. They hear a signal that the country is changing its direction. And that's when the financial markets start to get nervous. They begin pricing in this new political risk. And what happens next? Well, suddenly, getting loans gets a whole lot harder. International aid might come with way more strings attached. And just like that, poof, a nation's options, its ability to make choices, just starts to shrink. And this is probably the most crucial takeaway of all. Perception often outweighs intent. The global system, it's not a person, it's impersonal, it's a machine, and it reacts to perceived risk, not what a leader intended to say. It literally cannot afford to care whether those words were just for a home crowd or not. It sees risk, and it acts. So that brings up a really important question. Why is Pakistan so particularly sensitive to this perception machine? What makes it so vulnerable? Well, that brings us to the specific factors that create what you could call Pakistan's incredibly narrow margin for error. Okay, so there are really four key sensitivities we need to talk about. First up, there's a huge dependency on external financing. Market confidence is super fragile and it relies heavily on big players like the IMF. Second, the whole security ecosystem is built on these formal partnerships, and those partnerships come with very strong external expectations. You can't just ignore them. Third, there's the constant watch of international monitoring groups. This isn't just about reputation, it directly affects the cost of doing business. And finally, and this is a big one, the nuclear factor. The world just has a much, much lower tolerance for unpredictability when you're talking about a nuclear-armed state. It just does. Now, let's be super clear here. The point is not that Pakistan is powerless. Not at all. It's more like it's walking a tightrope. A nation in this position just has fewer strategic cards to play, and the cost for any misstep, any miscalculation is way, way higher. The room for error, it's tiny. All right, enough with the theory. Let's look at some real-world lessons from this system itself. We're going to see how these narratives create actual concrete consequences out in the wild. A really good way to see this in action is to look at the Imran Khan era as a kind of case study. And look, it's really important we frame this impartially. We are not talking about domestic politics here or trying to guess his intentions. We are focusing strictly on one thing, the external signal effect of his rhetoric. What message was the outside world receiving? So from the outside looking in, that perception machine we talked about picked up on three pretty clear signals. First, all the anti-American rhetoric wasn't just seen as talk, it was read as a fundamental shift in diplomatic posture. Second, some of the messaging that was coded with sympathy toward Taliban-linked narratives, Well, that set off major international alarm bells. And third, any kind of rhetorical closeness to sanctioned states like Iran immediately increased the perceived risk for anyone thinking of investing in the country. And this really is the key. It doesn't matter one bit whether the intent was for domestic politics. The external system reads it as trajectory. That's it. The perception machine just sees the country changing course, and it reacts. Plain and simple. And believe me, this isn't just a theory. The system has some very powerful tools to enforce its rules. I mean, look at this. You have Iraq back in 1990. The lesson there? Once a global coalition forms against you, your options can vanish, like overnight. Then there's Syria after 2020, stuck in this long-term freeze effect on investment. The takeaway? Just surviving doesn't mean you're recovering. You can be stuck with no options for years. And then, of course, Iran, with its hardened sanctions ecosystem. That teaches us that sanctions aren't really moral judgments. They're just tools of enforcement. And this is what brings it all back to Pakistan's situation. See, a state doesn't need to become the next Iran to feel this pressure. Not even close. All it needs is to be perceived as moving towards that kind of unpredictability, especially if it doesn't have the economic buffers to handle the shock. Okay, but hold on a second. I know what you're thinking. We see countries like Russia or China using confrontational language all the time, right? So why can they get away with it when it would be so incredibly costly for a country like Pakistan? Well, that's what we call the strong state contrast. This comparison really lays it all out. On one side, you have constrained states. For them, the price of confrontation is paid early and immediately. Why? Because they lack what we call redundancy, the ability to absorb shocks. They have to prioritize stability just to hold on to the few options they have. But then you look at strong states. They can absorb the pressure and come back to the bargaining table later. They have redundancy in spades, massive economies, deep resources, control over supply chains. For them, confrontation isn't a gamble, it's a strategic tool. So, given all this, what's the path forward? What's the smart play? Well, that brings us to our conclusion, a really practical, non-ideological doctrine. Let's call it sovereignty through stability. Here's the bottom line. Sovereignty without the capacity to actually do anything, it's just a symbol. It's not a real strategy. That's why balanced diplomacy isn't about giving in. It's about survival. It's about buying yourself the time and the space you need to build real options for the future. And how do you build those options? How do you get to a place of strength? You have to build the buffers first. That means, number one, achieving real, durable economic stability. Number two, building unwavering, rock-solid institutional credibility. Number three, purposefully and strategically diversifying your dependencies so you're not reliant on any one power. And number four, quietly accumulating leverage behind the scenes. It's only after you've done all that that confrontation becomes a calculated choice instead of a desperate, reckless gamble. And that really leaves us with the central lesson here, the one thing to take away from all of this. In the brutal game of geopolitics, restraint today is what buys you options for tomorrow. It always comes back to that simple, powerful idea: strength first, statements later.